Conference. I think you'll all agree with me that this has been an incredibly stimulating conference. My goodness, amazing speakers, eh? I'll be giving more formal thanks to everybody working with Parkland who's been engaged in this a little bit later here, but for now, fabulous job everybody involved with the Institute. The work you've done is really paid off this weekend. Great conference. And what we've heard throughout the conference repeatedly is that there's growing inequality in the world, growing unfairness, and real threats to democracy. And that much of this growing inequality, social, economic, political, is really tied to class struggle. But class, as we were reminded on a few occasions throughout the weekend, is not a permanent entity. It's not even kind of a thing in itself. It's really a kind of experiential identity that is emergent. And it emerges at different points in time out of very different kind of material circumstances. And what we're seeing, of course, over the last number of decades is a very changed material environment in which new kinds of classes and new kinds of struggle are emergent. Class, as always, has been defined by and part of a quest for greater freedom, greater equality, greater democracy. And at the heart of democracy, it seems to me, is the role of collectivities of human beings fighting for a vision of the future. Part of one of these collectivities has for the longest period of time been unions. Just as society is changing, just as the classes, the nature of classes has been changing, so also have been and must change unions, and that has been very much part of the debate here today. But unions remain still a very vital part of this debate of the kind of world that we're going to create in the future. To help us figure out and answer some of these questions, we have as our closing speaker today, Stephanie Ross. Class inequality in workers, labor movements, and the unfinished struggle for democracy is the title of what she will be speaking about today. And we're incredibly happy to have her here to finish off. Stephanie Ross is Associate Professor of Work and Labor Studies in the Department of Social Science and co-director of the Global Labor Research Center at York University. Her research and teaching focuses on public sector unionism, union renewal, and democracy in working class and social movement organizations. Current areas of research include public sector unions' unique sources of power, the strategic implications for unions of deindustrialization, and the forms and sources of anti-union sentiment in Canada. With Larry Savage, she has edited 2 books, Rethinking the Politics of Labor in Canada and Public Sector Unions in an Age of Austerity. She is also president of the Canadian Association for Work and Labor Studies. Please join with me in welcoming Stephanie Ross to the podium today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trevor. And I want to say thanks to you and to Larissa, who did a lot of the organizational work to get me here, and everyone at Parkland for the invitation to speak to you today, and also for being such great hosts. This is my second time in Alberta in 6 months. Some of you might remember that I spoke at the excellent conference put on by the Alberta Labour History Institute this past June, and I guess we liked each other well enough to go on a second date, so thanks for taking me out again. As at ALHI, I have the responsibility for going last. And this is in some ways an advantage, but also a burden. And like Guy Standing said in his talk on the opening evening, I've had the experience of other people stealing all of my best lines and wondering if there's really much left to say. But the advantage is also that I get to pull together, to summarize, to reinforce, and maybe challenge a little bit some of what was said, and hopefully shine a different light on our discussions here, both in terms of understanding what's happening to the labor movement and what we might do about it. So, as Trevor said, the title of my talk is about Class Inequality and Workers, Labor Movements and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy, but I guess it might also be called an alternative title, Why Do They Hate Us So Much? Because really what I want to talk to you today about is capitalism. When we're talking about profiteers, which is one of the key words in the title, we're really talking about capitalists. And we're talking about the political economic system that enables them to exercise an extraordinary and undemocratic power over our society. And I think that we need to understand the nature of their power to create and rule over class-divided societies, and how, in very important ways, historically and even today, the labor movement has been central to creating forms of democratic counterpower against them. So today I want to make 4 major points. First, I think that we can only really understand the concerted and coordinated attack on the labor movement in general, but also in its specific form as it's being experienced in Canada, as an attempt to eradicate one of the few sources of organized counterpower for the working classes in capitalist societies. This attack is aimed at destroying the organizational, economic, and political capacity, not just to oppose capital's prerogatives, but also to create an alternative reality not subject to the discipline of the market. In Canada, this is most obvious in the form of the attack, and I'm going to start the main part of my talk highlighting some of that. The second point I want to make is that given the purpose of these attacks, we need to remind ourselves just how it is the labor movement is a force for democracy, a source of economic and industrial democracy, of political democracy, of social democracy, and also internal union and experiential participatory democracy. And I want to emphasize, I want to argue that this democratic potential is quite radical, because it gets at, in many ways, the root of capitalist power over us, and it provides us with some, at least, of the tools we need to challenge that power. Third, however, I want to acknowledge that this democratic potential is just that, it's potential. And while, of course, in the face of these attacks, we want to protect the institutions of the labor movement, we also have to confront the way that the post-war labor movement, as it accommodated itself to the market, became limited in all sorts of ways, that blunted its radical potential, that stopped the process of deepening democracy. And I think now, as we make attempts to defend what institutions and capacities we did build, make us very vulnerable, particularly because we have failed to continue to expand our community of solidarity. The last point I want to make, hopefully I'll get to it, is that if we are to revive the labor movement's capacity to challenge the undemocratic power of capital, we must develop, or maybe recapture, a more ambitious vision beyond one of managing the inequalities that are continually produced and reproduced by the market and the state, a more inclusive community of solidarity that includes those large and growing segments of the working class that Guy talked about on Friday night, who are left out of the protections we've designed, and does that in real rather than rhetorical or symbolic ways. That we must develop a more creative approach to the question of the organizational forms that we will include in the labor movement and move beyond what became institutionalized in the post-war era as the primary form of working class representation, the certified trade union. And we need to have a serious examination of the internal democratic life of our movement and ask how transformative the experience and empowering the experiences of life, of decision-making, are in our own organizations. Okay, so let's start with some maybe things that we know but are a little depressing. The attack on union power in Canada. And again, I'm going to focus on Canada, but we know that, as was emphasized before, that this is a global attack. It takes different national forms. And I just want to talk a little bit about the form that it's taking in the Canadian context. We see really three major types of attack on the labor movement, particularly in the form of attempts to change labor law and the way that the state engages in the regulation of labor relations. The first is an attack on the basis of union organizational strength as it was developed in the post-war period, what we call union security, right? This is primarily in terms of the attack on the Rand formula. You might recall that in 2002 in the United States, both Indiana and Michigan, right, long-standing industrial heartland states that had strong labor movements, became right-to-work states, bringing the total in the United States to 24 states that have a prohibition of some kind against what we call here the Rand formula, the requirement that if your work is covered by the terms of a collective agreement, whether you want to be a union member or not, you must pay dues to share in the cost of creating those terms and conditions of work that everyone benefits from. In other words, no free riding. Right? And that was a very important decision made by Ivan Rand, Supreme Court Justice Ivan Rand, in his 1946 decision, arbitral decision to resolve the 1945 Ford strike in Windsor. Of course, there have always been forces within Canadian society who were discontented with that particular arrangement, but we have not seen such a concerted and nationwide movement to undermine the Rand formula as we have basically since 2008 and onward, and especially since 2012. In Ontario, of course, most famously, the former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Tim Hudak, put out a policy paper in June 2012 called Flexible Labor Markets, in which he floated the idea of ending the Rand formula in Ontario and replacing it with what's called an open shop or right-to-work arrangement. The Saskatchewan Party under Brad Wall also explored this in 2013 as part of their labor law reforms. Both of those individuals had to pull back from those proposals. They did not make it into the Saskatchewan Bill 85. And in 2014, Hudak had to make a very public announcement backing away from including right to work in the platform on which they ran in the 2014 provincial election. And I think that we can say that that's a strong victory for the labor movement, although I certainly wouldn't want to encourage complacency on that front. Because there continue to be important voices in favor of right to work. Pierre Poilievre advocates it at the federal level for the federal public service. In 2012, in a National Post article, he said that, quote, he's heard directly from public servants who are not happy with how PSAC manages its union dues. I think reflecting the Harper government's more general trend to make policy on the basis of anecdote rather than evidence. but sometimes they're useful, right? Sometimes they're useful. The Fraser Institute, of course, is a very strong advocate for what they call worker choice laws, and Merit Canada, the Association of Non-Union Contractors, is very committed to open shop and continues to press for such legislation. In fact, their origins are rooted in a 1999 constitutional challenge that they made to compulsory union membership in the Quebec construction industry. That is their forging struggle. The second important attack on Canadian labor movement has been the attack on our union's economic leverage through creating various forms of constraint on the capacity to collectively bargain. I think I don't need to tell an Alberta audience about the legislative restrictions that your government has rolled out, which are quite shocking, particularly in their restriction of the capacity of workers to even talk about collectively withdrawing their labor. But this is not unique to Alberta, that throughout the country, whether it's British Columbia, Ontario, Nova Scotia, etc., provincial governments throughout have issued bills to restrict the scope of collective bargaining, what the issues are that workers can bargain over, and intervene in their capacity to use what bargaining leverage they have when they actually attempt to do so. This is, in some ways, not a complete departure for Canadian governments, but usually, at least historically, those governments have used temporary ad hoc measures to restrict, in particular, public sector workers' collective bargaining rights, using back-to-work legislation in particular instances without changing the underlying legal framework of labor rights. Leo Panich and Don Swartz called this permanent exceptionalism, though, meaning that governments began to use this tool of ad hoc intervention so often that they basically were making permanent changes to workers' labor rights without actually changing the law. But now they have moved in some important ways beyond ad hoc interventions to try and shift in a more permanent way the balance of power between labor and employers. The third area of attack has been on what I'm going to call union political activity and capacity. And this takes the form of Bill C-377. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this bill, but it's worth reminding ourselves what this is. It's unlike some of the other Orwellian-named Harper pieces of legislation. This is actually a very boringly named piece of legislation, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. Snore. But it is a deep, potentially deep attack on union political capacity, on the very notion that unions have a legitimate role to play in the political realm. Bill C-377 would have all unions at all levels of the union structure publish on the Canada Revenue Agency website senior officers' salaries and benefits, lists of assets and liabilities, loans receivable, the time and money spent on organizing activities, members' pension payments over $5,000, the nature of any expenditure over $5,000 under threat of fines of $1,000 a day for noncompliance. The labor movement has primarily attacked this on the basis of the enormous impact of logistics problems that this would have on the labor movement. We're going to spend so much time filling out paperwork, we're not able to do anything else. That is surely true. But I think that in some ways that misses the point. That misses the point of what C-377 is about. That if they cannot get right to work laws in the immediate short term, they want to be able to expose, both to the union membership, but also to the broader public, the way in which the labor movement spends its money on advocacy. They want to expose the political engagement of the labor movement, support for particular kinds of social justice organizations that might be considered dangerous or problematic, certainly ties with particular political parties. And they want to be able to activate and mobilize segments of the union membership who oppose these expenditures to fight for what in the US are called Paycheck Protection Acts. These are laws that specifically allow union members to opt out of that portion of their dues that are allocated towards political expenditures. So yes, maybe we might agree that unions have a legitimate role in workplace representation and collective bargaining, but that's it. Everything else is really kind of a frill, an extra, and that workers should have to be able to select, have the right to select whether or not their union engages in and funds various forms of political activity and advocacy. I think that is the deeper threat of C377. It's not just about red tape. It goes to the heart of what the labor movement does in our society, providing a form of real counterpower for workers in the economy, but also in the political realm. People often say, especially on the right wing, that the labor movement really is a spent force. So it's really not that relevant anymore. But my question is, if that were true, then why so much time, energy, resources spent on these forms of attack? Why, if the labor movement is so toothless, so irrelevant, must it be put in its place in this way? And I think that's because the labor movement still provides us with important, effective forms of counterpower. In some ways, the easiest thing that we can do is, and I think we've done that through this conference, I think it's really important for us to do this, is to show how the labor movement is an equalizing force, right? We can show how unions directly attack economic inequality. First, it's clear that where union density is higher, the share of national income going to the wealthiest is lower. There's an inverse relationship, and you can see that very clearly historically. The Economic Policy Institute in the United States has a very nice report from 2012 that shows very clearly that the share of national income going to the wealthiest 10% decreases as the labor movement is on the rise. A second measure you can find in Parkland's own report on the job that we talked about this weekend and that David Campanella presented on yesterday, which shows a similar trend using a different measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. So measuring the rate of inequality in a whole society, how polarized income is in a society. That is clear that where there is a greater presence of unions, the rate of inequality is less. And third, from the Canadian Labour Congress's own annual report on the union advantage, which we've also talked a lot about this weekend, they show very clearly that unionization nets workers a clear wage premium. Although, whether or not that actually produces an equalizing force on society depends entirely on how widespread unionization is, and that's a point I want to come back to later on. So I think that, we have a good sense of that. We know that unions are a force for greater economic equality, both for individuals, right, mobility, and for the communities and the broader society that we live in. But I think related to this, and in some ways even more profound, is the labor movement's role as a democratic counterweight. Yesterday, Elaine Bernard talked about the importance of unions giving workers a collective voice in the workplace, what some people historically have called industrial citizenship. This includes the right to participate in important decisions over one's working life, to have a right to due process when you're being disciplined, to have a collective agreement rather than a manager unilaterally and arbitrarily decide what is fair treatment, etc. All of this provides the real possibility for dignity for working people in the workplace. But I think that for us to truly understand the importance of this role, we have to be reminded of how deeply undemocratic the capitalist workplace is, and how deeply undemocratic the capitalist labor market is. That both of these realms subjects workers to the power and control of their employers in a very deep sense, even when we are able to modify that through our workplace action. The image of the capitalist labor market that we get from mainstream economics, a religion maybe more than an academic discipline, is one of free and equal buyers and sellers of labor power. We're all looking around as individuals for the right price to make the most advantageous trade. And we're just responding to price signals. And in that process, as we're all searching for the best price of labor that we want to sell our labor at or buy someone else's labor at, that exchange will produce an equilibrium. Everyone will be happy in the end. As Milton Friedman argued in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, no one forces anyone into a wage contract to make any given exchange. And I suppose that's true on the face of it, although certainly not everywhere. There are a lot of exchanges that get made at the point of a gun. But let's say that's true for a country like Canada. But as Canadian political economist C.B. Macpherson once pointed out in his very important and foundational article, Elegant Tombstones, which was a critique of Friedman, this is baloney. He didn't say that, but basically that's the summary of his article. The labor market isn't equal for buyers and sellers. For one thing, there are many more sellers of labor, workers, than there are buyers, employers. This gives employers an enormous amount of market power to set the terms of exchange. For another, individual workers can't exit the labor market if it doesn't offer the price they want. They are, in other words, market dependent. In fact, capitalism is designed precisely to make that so. The history of capitalism is the history of dispossessing people from any means of survival outside of the market, of meeting human needs for goods and for work or for anything else outside of the market. Everywhere capitalism sets down roots, and beginning with England, capitalists set about finding ways, such as buying up land and monopolizing it, destroying the commons, as an alternate means of survival, to force people into the labor market and to keep them there on ever cheaper and more desperate and more compliant terms. At its base, then, the capitalist labor market forces workers to compete with each other to access not the means of production, although that's true, but the means of survival. In that sense, capital's undemocratic power in the labor market is rooted in and it's reinforced by their control over the workplace. Employers get to decide who gets access to what kinds of work, how jobs are organized, what skill levels and working conditions people are going to work under, what pace they're going to work at, what purpose their labor is going to be put to. These two forms of power in the workplace and in the labor market are precisely what the labor movement through unions seek to interrupt. They interrupt the capacity of employers to impose managerial authority with no capacity to respond. They interrupt the capitalist use of workers' labor at any price that suits them. But early on, the labor movement also recognized that workplace action would never be enough. Would never be enough to counter this kind of workplace power. For sure, unions would organize to try and take wages out of competition, meaning that we would try to set standards in a workplace, in a sector, in a country, so that workers seeking work would not compete with each other in a race to the bottom. That if employers wanted to compete with each other, they'd have to find other ways to do it and not on the backs of workers. Right? And that is what the promise, the real promise of widespread unionization entails. But even so, that wouldn't necessarily be enough. Why? Because capitalist power is political and not just economic. They are aided in their attempts to create and sustain those spaces of their power in the economy by the state. We call this creating a good business climate. But what this means is that through law sometimes, and sometimes through violence, and sometimes a little bit from column A and column B, the state helps to reproduce a system in which profit trumps other social values and priorities. So it's for this reason that not just that the labor movement has been, from its inception, at the forefront of struggles for political democracy, not just economic and industrial democracy, political democracy, in two ways. One, getting workers access to political rights, the right to vote, was always at the forefront of the labor movement's agenda. Right? The labor movement was the working class was the first class to assert the right, the universal right of all people, regardless of whether or not they owned property, to engage meaningfully in political life as citizens. Right? That having a political voice and a capacity to vote would prevent the domination of business interests in the political sphere. Right? Jane McAlevey referred the other day to boss law. I think we can also refer to boss political parties. That the mainstream political parties are parties of the bosses. And what came with seeking the right to vote for working people was also seeking to create an independent political vehicle for working class people, separate from those of the bosses. Now, we could go down the path of debating what that vehicle should be like, and of course, that's created enormous divisions within the 20th century labor movement. But suffice it to say that there was general agreement that the state, without organized intervention from working people, could not be trusted to produce pro-worker legislation or policy. It would always default to the status quo, meaning the interests of capital. Right? Those political rights were needed to create a positive legislative framework for unionization, right? So economic and political democracy had everything to do with each other, right? You needed laws that supported unionization, that attempted to create labor standards that applied to everyone. And this was certainly struggled for. However, even this approach to democratization wasn't enough. There's a second way in which the labor movement engaged in forms of democratization, and that is by seeking social democracy. And I don't mean that in the formal sense that we call social democratic parties in the post-war period. Social democracy was a broad movement, political movement before World War I that encompassed lots of different political currents. Which later broke up into what we now know as social democratic and then for a time the communist currents. But what they did agree on before World War I was the idea that even when workers got access to the vote, it wouldn't necessarily be enough to allow them to meaningfully exercise that right. For political citizenship to be meaningful, workers needed both rights to participate and the conditions, the socioeconomic conditions that made participation possible. In other words, they needed greater socioeconomic equality, access to education, access to leisure time, etc. Formally equal citizens do not live equal lives. Economic and social inequality impair the capacities, even today, of most citizens to effectively participate in political life. And those conditions also provide the wealthy, both as individuals and in their corporate manifestations, with much greater capacity to participate and influence political decisions. In other words, what working people needed, in the words of T.H. Marshall, was social citizenship. The right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, to share in the full social heritage, and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society. These are the rights that the labor movement argued were too important to be left to the market to dictate who got them and who didn't. Social citizenship, though, was more than just a moral imperative, more than about stopping poverty or immiseration or ill health, as sort of were the key tenets of the post-war welfare state in Britain and Canada and elsewhere. It certainly was a moral imperative, but it was about more than that. It was about shifting the social and economic power in the society by rebuilding the commons. Rebuilding the commons in the form of social or public goods, as Elaine Bernard referred to yesterday, to provide a real alternative to the market. Right? The social wage, those goods and income supports that are distributed to citizens as rights or entitlements rather than something you buy through the wages that you're able to earn on the market, is important, not just because it redistributes our collective social wealth, but also because it reduces workers' dependence on the market to meet their needs. Decommodified services, services that are not bought and sold, like healthcare, and other programs like unemployment insurance that allow workers to wait outside of the market, outside of the labor market, until conditions improve, until they might be able to get a job at a wage and with conditions that meet their needs, desires, whether they're economic or otherwise, is an important shift in social power in the post-war period. In other words, what the labor movement fought for in this period was designed to stop workers from being supplicants. As Guy Standing mentioned, more and more of us are being returned to that condition today. And I think that we should understand the ferocity of the attack on the public sector today, both in terms of the services that it provides and the workers and their unions that provide them, as not just about saving money, but because the social wage is a barrier to their ability to make us all supplicants. I could talk about the way in which the attack on employment insurance program and the use of the temporary foreign worker program are examples of this, but maybe I'll leave that aside for now. There's a fourth way in which the labor movement is importantly democratizing, and that is through its own organizations, and Elaine did talk about that significantly yesterday. But I just want to reiterate, I want to emphasize how important it is that the labor movement provide workers with a deeper experience of power and collective control than is available in the very thin forms of democracy that exist in the broader society. I mean, don't get me wrong. I believe strongly in the right to vote and the need to participate in the electoral system despite its disappointments. But it is a thin form of democracy. It is occasional. It is a delegation to others to speak on our behalf. It doesn't involve us in an ongoing way as a function of its operation in the way that unions potentially provide people with. And I think that we can't underestimate how transformative the experience of direct participatory democracy in the labor movement can be for people. Not just because, they feel better about themselves, but because they change their expectations of what democracy means more broadly, and it develops in them the capacities for self-rule. As Marx put it, and I like this quote, it helps workers throw off all the habits of deference that they have accumulated over centuries. So I hope that I've made the case for why the role of the labor movement in democracy is quite deeper, is quite a lot deeper and potentially more radical than we generally think of it as. But I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is an unfinished struggle. Some of those reasons have been, in some ways, the process of deepening and expanding economic, political, social, and union democracy has been short-circuited, has stalled out. Some of those reasons are externally imposed. They're structural reasons, and we've, I think, talked a lot about them through the course of this conference. Globalization, neoliberalism, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of power. They have a lot of power. We should acknowledge that they do have a lot of power. But there are also reasons having to do with the strategic decisions that the labor movement itself made at given moments in time that have short-circuited or truncated the struggle for further democratization. On the economic industrial democracy front, obviously we have lost significant ground in the workplace. I was very struck by David Campanel's report yesterday in which he documented that the vast majority of the labor movement in Alberta really isn't trying to organize workers very much anymore. We're not really trying to expand that segment of the working class that is unionized. There are reasons, some of them good, some bad, for that reality. It would be in some ways better if we were trying and failing. At least we'd be trying. But we're not trying, and I don't think that's specific to Alberta. I think that if we did a similar study in the rest of the country, we'd see that most unions are simply not trying, not putting significant enough resources into the task of expanding unionization. It means that, in practical terms, the majority, almost 70% of working people in Canada do not have access to forms of counterpower in their workplace. If they have some forms of voice, they are given to them by the employer through internal representation systems, feedback, open door policies, etc. But, at the pleasure of the employer. This is a problem. We have allowed our community of solidarity to stagnate. We've also allowed our community of solidarity to fragment. There are really important inequalities within the working class, and I think Guy's presentation on Friday night really vividly documented what those inequalities are. Whether that's between union and non-union workers. I think that this is why I'll come back to this question of using the union advantage as a PR strategy, and why I think it's, in some ways, a mistake. It's not that I want us to pretend that unions don't make this really important really important transformational effect on people's lives. They do. But in a context where almost 70% of workers in Canada probably have no realistic hope, they think, of ever having a union, it's rather cold comfort. It's a form, in some ways, of trickle-down economics for the labor movement. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but I have grown increasingly uncomfortable with the notion that we say to our fellow members in the community, we make lots of money and we're going to spend it in your stores. You know, it's going to get around to you, without challenging the underlying exclusions that mean that so many people themselves don't have access to those higher wages and that form of democratic control in their workplace. Thank you. I think this is best captured by something that Tom Walkham wrote, who's a Toronto Star columnist. Some of you may have read some of his work. In 2010, he wrote a column in which he elaborated the concept of reverse class resentment. And I'm going to quote from it. We talk about it in our book, Rethinking the Politics of Labor. So Walkham says that, the political right has mastered the art of mobilizing reverse class resentment. What is this? Today, he says, class resentments have turned on their head. The focus of anger is not the silk-hatted capitalist, but his unionized workers, with their job protection guarantees, their pension plans, and their good wages. Increasingly in the world of media and popular culture, it is not the rich who are blamed for their excesses, but the poor, although we might say that's changed since Occupy. The undeserving welfare recipient, the shiftless single mother, the unemployment insurance cheat. Resentment has become a potent tool of the right. The left's resentments were predicated on the notion that if some are privileged, all should be. For all of its problems, and resentment is a difficult force to control, it was at least optimistic. At its best, it encouraged people through their governments to improve the lot of those who were hurting. The new resentment is based on the presumption that if I don't have something, neither should you. Its aim is not to improve anyone's lot, but to cut down to a common level of misery those uppity enough to think they deserve better. Now, what is our response to this? I can tell you that in Toronto, the response of the Toronto left, broadly speaking, particularly because in the face of the popularity of a local political figure you may have heard of, Rob Ford, and his brother, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, that, it has been shown quite starkly that large numbers of the lower middle and working class of Toronto, immigrant first and second generation, voted in significant numbers for Rob Ford and then Doug Ford in the last mayoralty. There are lots of amazing maps online that you can see to show that. This is a crucial problem, right? That is the constituency of the labor movement. But they are not with us. And the Toronto left's response is to ridicule them, to talk about them as though they're stupid. They don't understand their class interests, or, they identify with ignorant people. And what's the matter with them? But I think that's the wrong response. I think there is a real material basis for their vote. And that is the long-term exclusion over 10, 20, 30 years now from the protections and forms of power that I just talked about. And unless we are able, as a movement, to confront that and our role in that, we are going to continue to see those dynamics deepen. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll conclude. The other factor that is driving, the other problem is that we also have, in some important ways, made our accommodations with the market as a movement. In the post-war period, our ambitions changed from creating a real alternative, various means for doing so, right? But creating an accumulation of reforms that would potentially radically alter the power relationships in society, right? That, for a long time, was the goal even of social democratic parties. In the post-war period, both the unions and the social democratic parties gave up on that vision. We accepted the market and its power over us. And our ambition was to modify its worst effects on us, to maybe make capitalism a slightly more humane system to work within. And I think that we are now living with the effects of those choices, right? Our incapacity, the incapacity of our organizations to envision something beyond capitalism. Capitalism that we have to accept, or it's going to be imposed on us, this acceptance, is antithetical to full human development and to our survival on the planet. I could talk about both the disappointments of unions in becoming contractors of labor rather than, and protecting vested interests rather than acting as a sword of justice, using its power for the extension and deepening of democracy in the ways that I lined out. We could also talk about the disappointments of social democracy when it did get into power, as a chapter by Brian Evans in the book that Larry and I edited, I think, very eloquently and perhaps depressingly outlines. I think this is what we are now confronted with as a labor movement. Will we continue to protect the realms that we already represent? Will we protect those bulwarks but not expand them? Or will we renew our commitment to being a sword of justice? I think that the survival of the labor movement requires that we reconnect with the more deeply radical democratic mission of the labor movement. I think that, as I started out by saying, that we need to confront the ways in which our organizations don't challenge any longer the undemocratic power of capital over lives and make that a central feature in our economic and political work. It's not enough to come to a modus operandi with them. We also have to take very seriously the need to expand in a real way, not just in a symbolic way, the community of solidarity to include all of those segments of the working class. That means material commitment to using what power we do have to leverage gains for others, but also to leverage processes of empowerment for those others so that they can act on their own behalf. Third, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A because time is ticking, I think that we need to get seriously creative about the organizational forms that we consider to be part of the labor movement. That we need to make real space at the table for a whole variety of very interesting, exciting forms of worker organization that are going on, and not expect, not impose the model of union certification as the test of whether or not you are a workers' organization that deserves a seat at the table in the House of Labor. And then finally, in order for us to be able to make real claims about democracy in the broader society, we should not shy away from a sober examination of our own organizations. Right? If we can honestly say that our membership, the membership of our unions, does experience a real collective power, then we can go home. But if we have any doubts about that, this is an urgent task for us to face, because it is on this that the right will continue to push. They have their anecdotes, but they're not just anecdotes. There's a real malaise. And I think that I do think that we have the vision, the energy, the knowledge, and the commitment to confront that as a movement. I don't think we should be afraid of it. And I think that if we continue to shy away from that, we are not going to be able to realize what I still believe is the radical democratic potential of our movement, not just to liberate workers, but really the planet from the control of the profiteers. Thank you.
I told you we were going to finish off with a bang here. That was fabulous. I'm going to have a few announcements given a few minutes here, but do you want to take maybe 3 questions
sure.
here? I'm mindful of the time, but I know there's going to be some questions as well. So if we can take 3 questions, and first hands up, one over here, Annika. Midpoint just up here, yeah. Second one, and third. Oh, okay, Jay, way at the back here. Yeah, Annika, right here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your most inspiring and stimulating talk. At the beginning, I thought, oh, she doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation. You don't need it. You're very powerful.
Oh, thank you.
And you really revitalized my thinking about unions in Canada. I see them as a very civilizing force, and I'm completely in agreement, the attacks from the Harper regime. My specific question is, could you maybe just say, this wonderful union, the postal workers, have a big sign for them on my lawn. I cannot understand why at this moment there is not a broader support, because that is such a wonderful fight what those people are in, because we can all see, we all want home delivery, and we all can unify, we can all identify with this union. Could you comment on that?
And second question, just up here. Laura, if you want to just catch the one here.
Hi. One time we'll talk about, decreasing development of oil sands and not wanting the pipelines, and yet the labor union movement wants those kind of things for jobs. And I think our labor movement should go in a different direction, that they do more, have an environment protection arm of their organization, because it's almost like the labor movement are climate change deniers.
And the third and final question just over here.
Thank you. My question is somewhat related to the last question, and that is in confronting neoliberal corporatization and its attack upon working people and democracy. Unions and the labor movement need allies, and what I haven't heard so much of in the conference is the means and the necessity of cooperating with other movements. We had an excellent session on indigenous movements. We just had that, but they're concerned about their identity, the destruction of the earth. We have the environmental movement and the climate justice movement. We also have, in terms of those most under assault in some ways, are women and the women's movements. So our creating our future, I would think in terms of the labor movement, needs other allies. And in creating the vision, and I think it was just mentioned before, do we really need new pipelines, or do we need a different type of economy that's built on different principles and different foundations that is respectful of the needs and wants of other movements? Thank you.
Okay, great questions. So on the question of the Save Canada Post campaign and why is it not gaining more traction? I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. But what I would say is that I think that on the one hand, there is, I think, unevenness in how attached people are in their daily lives to the Postal Service. And that many, many people are less and less, they see it less and less as part of their lives. And so as a result, it's not, I think for many people, it doesn't seem to be as much of a priority in terms of preserving this element of, what I would say is the social wage, right? The public postal service is part of the commons that we've created that is, not completely market driven, although of course they've done all that they can to resubmit it to the market. So I do think that there is something that has changed about people's relationship to the Postal Service, and that there are some parts of people in our society for whom it is a very important source of communication, of social interaction, and for others it is not. So I think that's part of it. And I think too, people do suffer from a lack of hope, a lack of a sense of agency, that this is just sort of one more campaign of many, many campaigns that we have sort of nice posters and flyers and whatever, but that doesn't have the possibility of actually stopping the end of the service. So I think that there is a cynicism that's growing, and I think it requires us then to think about our strategies in the labor movement, whether or not our strategies are exerting the kind of pressure, the kind of, I think, disruptive pressure that is required to reverse a decision like this. And when I was at Hal High, I did, maybe intemperately, there was no camera here live streaming when I made this comment, but what the hell, I've got tenure now. Thank you. I'm very grateful. That, if we think about the history of the labor movement and its ability to make advances, it wasn't through writing letters, it wasn't through petitions, it was through the capacity to disrupt what was important to those who held power, whether that was economically or politically, electorally, or otherwise. And I think that, any legal change, any expansion of service, any preservation of service, we're going to have to think about how the use of disruptive strategies plays into that. And I think that, I say that without any arrogance about the difficulty of that. I recognize how challenging that is for many people in the current moment. And yet, I think that history tells us that unless we are able to disrupt them, they're not going to pay attention to us. So that's maybe a few things that I would say about that. The other two questions I think are very important, are related and very important. And in some of the other writing that I've done about social unionism, I did write a paper with a colleague about some of the contradictions in unions' approach to the question of the environment. And I was looking in particular at the then CAW. And I think that this goes to the heart of one of the essential characteristics of unions. And that is that they're not, even though they represent parts of the working class, they themselves are not class-wide organizations. They don't have a holistic view of the interests of the whole class. And so they are always in this tension between trying to protect what I refer to as sort of the vested interests of the section of the class that they represent, and how to square that with the sometimes contradictory interests of the broader working class and the broader society, right? Other movements that I think in important ways overlap with the working class, although not maybe exactly the same class location. And I think that that is a reality, that we are never going to, it will never be possible, I think, for all unions to divest themselves of those sectional interests, right? That they are protecting the livelihoods of their members. On the other hand, that's why we need broader political organizations to challenge the limits of that and to develop the capacity to create real economic alternatives, right? Economic alternatives where we decide what needs to be, what are the social needs that we need filled? How is it that people who are pipe fitters and laborers on the tar sands, how their very important skills could be otherwise used for social benefit? Right? This is a broader social struggle that we're engaged in. And not all segments of the labor movement are going to be at the forefront of that. It is difficult, right? But I think we have to acknowledge that sectionalism is a deep part of the character of unions, right? And I don't make an equivalence between unions and the whole labor movement. I think the whole labor movement is much larger than the institutional form of unions. I also have written a lot about what is called social unionism, and in particular in coalition work, and some of the tensions and difficulties in negotiating coalition relationships. And I think that what I can say in this short time is that very often the labor movement enters into coalition relationships in very ad hoc, shallow ways. Often in a crisis. We need allies. Come and be our allies, because they're kicking us to death. And those kinds of coalitions are often very unequal, and they don't produce long-term movements for social transformation. That coalitions have to be something that is made a priority by unions, and that priority can't just be having the top leadership of the union meet with the top leadership of their allies. It has to be embedded in the main business of the union, right? How can the union use what leverage it does have at the bargaining table and elsewhere to actually act materially on those common interests that overlap? And I think that until and unless the labor movement is willing to do that, willing to put its own, what sources of power it has to support the efforts of allies, it's going to be very difficult for them to make claims on the solidarity of others. Now, I'm saying that in a very stark way. There's obviously lots of really good practices, good coalition relationships throughout the labor movement, where, for instance, the Toronto library workers engaged in, I think, a very important strike a number of years ago that really made the connection between their own jobs, the need to improve the jobs of the most vulnerable in their bargaining unit, and the role that the library plays in providing services to the community. They constructed a very robust coalition that has lasted over many years. And so they have this coincidence of their own self-interest with the interest of the broader community. And I think that we can learn a lot from that. There's a lot of other examples, like Chicago teachers, that have also done long-term coalition building for mutual benefit. And I think that we have to study and learn from those models if we wanted to make our coalition relationships more meaningful and more mutual. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Stephanie, we have a small gift for your fabulous presentation here, and it's been wonderful to have you at the conference as a whole. Thank you very much. A few announcements, if I can Just before you head off here, there's a number of people I need to thank, sponsors and otherwise. Our conference sponsors, the Alberta Federation of Labour, Athabasca University, Canadian Union of Public Employees, Civic Service Union Local 52, the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, United Nurses of Alberta, University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, and the Wordsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. Thanks to all of you. Thanks also to the media sponsors for this event, Alberta Views Magazine, View Weekly, and CJSR Radio Edmonton. Thank you again very much. There are a number of small businesses I really want to thank for helping out also. First, Earth's General Store for their freshly roasted, freshly ground fair trade coffee. I'm sure you all enjoyed that the last few days. And other fair trade products that we served over the weekend. Bonton Bakery for the fabulous pastries. I ate too many of them. I know they were fabulous. And the Upper Crust for catering our lunch yesterday. Thank you to all those people. Perhaps most importantly, thanks to the many volunteers who have made this conference so successful, as always. We couldn't do the conference without our volunteers. We had over 50 volunteers this year who helped make this conference happen. This includes the conference steering committee, the facilitators, and all the volunteers who have been around the conference making everything work. Parkland cannot thank you enough. Special thanks to Ryan Williams for coordinating and taking care of all of our audiovisual needs, Mark Copen for ensuring that we get both audio and video recordings for the conference, for a website, and for coordinating the webcast, and to Rob Butts for all his efforts in keeping our conference website operational and online. I suspect there are any number of people who I don't even have time to name, and I'm probably going to overlook, but there's a few very large thank yous I have to give at this time. Our incredibly able, dedicated, fabulous staff, we couldn't work without them. One person I want to point out right now, Larissa Stendy, our conference coordinator. Larissa, please stand up, Larissa. Where's Lindsay? Lindsay Yao, if you're here, well, tell her that, anyway, thanks to her. Let's send the applause out the door to her. And finally, he never puts his name on my speaking notes here, but he deserves so much credit. I can't say enough of good things about him. Associate Director of Parkland Institute, Ricardo Acuna. Stand up, Rick. Come on. Please remember that Parkland receives no corporate, foundation, or government funding. Events like this are only possible because the generous donations we receive from individuals such as yourselves and the organizations you belong to. If you haven't filled out your pledge form yet, please think of doing that. Drop it off at the Parkland table, and feel free to take extras along to your friends. Please also drop off your name tags in the box outside the door. We reuse these. And finally, please, there are conference evaluations. We read these over, we pay attention to them. Your comments, your suggestions are highly valued. That's what makes these conferences great year after year. Thank you so much. We'll see you next year.